Welcome back to the Don's Trust Board Hustings. My name's Aaron Port, and I'm joined now by Charlie Talbot. Charlie, what a fascinating manifesto. Just reading through it, I like it. It's very, very in depth, very interesting. So many questions to ask you. First and foremost, plough lane. I think that's where I've got to start. What does it mean for you to be back? Obviously, having been so involved with the fundraising for it, what is it like to actually see it in all its beauty, in all its glory?
Yeah, it was pretty overwhelming, actually. I said to Andy Brassel on his podcast after the game, when I was, I think, a bit sleep deprived and gabbling in a way that the first game didn't really feel like an occasion, which it wasn't, of course, in a lot of ways. I think the occasion will clearly be when we get 9,000 of us back there. But because I was running around working to put that event on, I didn't notice. I didn't see the teams run out except as a cue to make sure the music played at the right time, and I missed both goals. But in a way, I didn't mind that, because that won't, the real event of the first game's yet to come. But it was in the days in the build-up when we were doing some filming and we were setting up, and you look round it and you think, this is ours and this is it, and this has been not just the last 18 years, but this has been 29 years. I went once to the old plough lane, and as Mark Jones said in one of the pieces we filmed, the old plough lane was great, but it was never something like this. We've now got this incredible facility. We've got this incredible platform to enable us to push on, and we've done something that literally everyone said was impossible. So now we've done that. Let's use it to the best of its capabilities and crack on for what needs to happen next.
Talk to me about the plough lane bond. I mean, what was it like setting it up, sort of maintaining it, pushing it, and what did you learn from it?
I think what I learned from it is that even at his most optimistic, Zav is never wrong. was probably the big takeaway, because I thought off the top of my head, or when we had that first, slightly fractious meeting, and we said, look, you haven't tried here, you haven't asked the fans, you haven't told us, what's going on, and we think there's money out there. I thought off the top of my head about 3 million was probably doable, which would have been enough to move the dial and really help. Xavier said from the very beginning, no, I think we can get to 5. We then worked, it was basically the two of us, and then with Graham and Damien worked on it. To go from a concept to having the website launched in 2 weeks is obviously nuts, particularly when those 2 weeks involved Christmas in the middle as well. So we very instantly were having to do everything at the same time. So we had to both get the messaging right at the same time as building a website with content that we were still writing while still getting it legal, obviously covered to make sure it was in compliance with all of the financial regulations and everything else. But it was clear from the first moment we said we were going to do it, 4 of us were able to do that because everyone did it. Four of us sort of did the setup and the top level bit. It's a bit like Bring the Dons Home in a way. And it worked because thousands of all of us, plural, all of us fans and owners, or everyone bought into supporting it. There was the great assembly of people out there kind of on the streets, kind of helping pushing it out there, who sort of swiftly moved on to become DLAG. So I think we learned about that was, A, get your messaging right, as it were. If you're going to, from a corporate point of view, if I was talking to someone not our fan base, I would say you get a clear message and you communicate it well. And we did that. And obviously it helps if you have an incredible cause. We couldn't have asset raised £5 million for something people didn't believe in. But most importantly, trust and empower our fan base, because, thousands and thousands of people got involved. Thousands of people bought bonds. Thousands of people took it out there to other people. And I think that's probably the key thing we learned, because the biggest success, or the allied success to it, wasn't just bringing in the money, which we desperately needed to keep construction on track and stay fan owned. But I think the biggest win with that, and speaking to the challenges ahead, was also one of messaging, because we took what was essentially an awful story, a bad communication breakdown, and potentially a chance for the fan base to really fracture and fall out. And we managed within a couple of months not just to bring the money in, but for everything to be a positive story. All the coverage of us going home is now in all of the press saying, the fans wanted this so much they funded it themselves. Now, actually, as we all know, that's a slight oversimplification, but the fans did, to a very large part, fund it themselves. £8 million of that was our money. And we've taken, therefore, a negative and turned it into a positive. And that has now led into some of the community work that's been extended through DLAG and what the foundation do. So again, now when we look to building it, we're going to a bunch of other local people and residents there saying, this is what we want to do and this is what we stand for. And what we stand for is very powerful, and hopefully a message that more people want to get involved with.
Absolutely. I mean, you talk in your manifesto about how you've provided operational support over the past 18 years, but you also mention how there are changes needed in structure and governance. Can you like expand on that?
Yeah, I think we have three challenges coming to a head simultaneously. Well, four if you count the fact that we don't actually currently have any aims and ambitions because we've ticked them all off, which is a nice problem to have. But got back in the league, stayed fan owned, built a stadium. Everyone said that was impossible. Done. We've got three things now, all of which really require quite urgent attention. The club. Well, the three board structure does not have enough operational resource in place across the football club board, the PLC board, and the Don's Trust board, in the sense that really has been used as a sticking plaster in operational senses for too long. I may have disagreed with some of their conclusions, but if you look at the amount of work, for example, Mark Davis and other people, Ed Leake and any of the other outgoing board members were pulled in to do to make sure the stadium was built. I mean, very grateful that they did, but that's a slightly nuts system. So there needs to be operational resource allocated in all areas. We've seen, if you look at the quality of candidates who's come forward, and there's some great ideas there, and there's some people who've really got fantastic things to offer. All of those, all of these 11 people should be doing stuff for the club, the trust, whichever five get elected, because we know there are more people out there. The bond proved that again. We said we've got this idea, and more people who worked in finance came forward and helped us do it. Secondly, however, one of the reasons why we reached that awful impasse in November and had those fractious meetings is because the trust in its oversight role hadn't communicated to members what was going on and hadn't engaged with them far enough in advance. So there needs to be a real overhaul of how the trust provides that oversight and that governance structure over what should be resource boards underneath it. And then thirdly, therefore, to achieve those two aims, I think we need to look very carefully at how it's currently structured. Then there are people who know more about this than I do, but partly as a result of working on the bond, it's something that we started discussing with other people. I've had discussions, for example, with Dave Boyle, who was obviously instrumental through Supporters Direct in the whole idea of fan-owned clubs in the first place. Having essentially three boards rather than two doesn't really make any sense. So one of those sort of needs to not really exist in a meaningful way. And so we really need to have a clear view of this board provides oversight, the Don's Trust board. It is accountable to members. It consults members. It informs members. It empowers members. And it ensures that what happens on a day-to-day basis fits in with the overarching plan and structure. And then we need a clearly resourced, full operational board, sitting somewhere, incorporating aspects, presumably, of what at the moment is currently there on the PLC and what remains of the football club board, actually getting stuff done.
Can you define what you mean by fully resourced, though?
Yes, I mean having enough people in place to run without lurching from crisis to crisis. I mean, in many ways, as Wimbledon fans, we're at our best in a crisis. We've just proved that again this year. But we've got this fantastic new shiny asset, and we shouldn't need to lurch from short-term problem to short-term problem. We should now be able to put things in place so that we have long-term structures, long-term aims, and we can continue to grow and do things without them all needing to be done yesterday because something bad has happened. So you look across the commercial department, you look across the media and the digital offerings, you look particularly at the moment, obviously we, like every other club, are only touch points with what euphemistically most places would call their customers. We're very glad to be able to say it's with our fans and owners. That's nearly all digital at the moment. There's much more we could be doing there. Specifically on a couple of areas around that, we looked at bringing stuff in to do that one-off event. There are things that could be done at the stadium, but there's a very few people actually working full-time for the club, and they're incredibly busy. And I think all of those areas, and around the commercial space, and then monetizing the events, the hybrid, the digital space, the things I know most about. But you look at what Roger's come forward and said in terms of regeneration projects for the whole area. That's clearly great. You look at what the foundation are doing, you look at what DLAG are doing. We need to make sure there are people in place and resource in place. And that doesn't necessarily, or in many cases, that doesn't necessarily mean money either. But if it does need to be structured properly, we shouldn't shy away from doing that.
You talk about media, marketing and commercial endeavours. What sort of markers do you want to see the club set going forward? What do you want to... what achievements do you want to see from the DTB and the club in the future within those categories?
I think we need we need some very clear kind of targets and things to aim at. I mean, obviously, the last 9 months have been pretty weird for anyone in any industry. So potentially the marketplace for, you know, looking at a strict number of, we want to have this amount brought in through sponsorship or through the new events business. Now, I own an events business. We produced a big event on Friday night that was finally a digital version that should have been a real world event 6 months ago. Funnily enough, the editor of Conference News, Martin Fuller, is a Wimbledon fan as well. So there was already kind of appetite to look in on that event space and say, look, you know, we can really put together something very special here. But that entire industry is in what could be tactfully described as a state of flux. You know, that old method of hiring out an event space isn't going to rebound suddenly at some point in February or March. The appetite around there, or the opportunity there, has now become much more around providing something that's hybrid, something that pulls in all of those kind of digital elements. So it doesn't necessarily need to be we must have, you know, 500,000 coming in from this, and we should have a headline sponsor at that. And, you know, we did go out, the club tried very hard to get a headline sponsor in to come in for the stadium. I mean, when that whole naming rights thing was first mooted, I did a bit of work with the club back then about how they were going to empower the marketing agency to go and sell that. At that point, the marketing agency thought that was an easy sell. Of course, even before COVID, that structure has changed a bit. So I'd like to see some clear targets, but more importantly, below those, I'd like to see what activity level we think is acceptable, where we go, okay, you know, we've spoken to 20 people, we've spoken to these, we've targeted these companies, you know, we've set up these structures. I think the next year or two is as much about that as putting a bottom line in it, because we do have the potential to go into what is, you know, is basically a new space, and to push something out there. So I would like to see clear targets for media, marketing and commercial.
I'm not sure if George wants me to go to questions now. George, Nick, Stuart, anyone want to go to questions?
Yeah, we have got some live questions.
There you go. Cheers, Charles.
So the first live question is, how will you achieve the changing governance and oversight model that you've advocated? Yeah. How would you change it?
Okay. By having discussions with the members, and obviously eventually through discussions with the members pushing something to a vote. I mean, I was part of pushing through the Back in 2 Ticks campaign, you know, which obviously empowered the board to sell Kings Meadow in order for the move to Pala Lane to happen. I think we're in a sort of a similar scenario here, where in the first stage is to explore some options and discuss, you know, and essentially to make sure that the members are fully consulted. My personal view at the moment, probably, forgive me, I haven't had time to see everyone else's hustings, but to slightly contradict what Luke said, I think we get a bit hung up around, in terms of share ownership numbers, we're getting a bit hung up around this difference between 75 and 51, when in fact, if we stay under the remaining structure, as soon as we drop below 75, you have potentially opened up under UK company law all kinds of bad things that could happen between taking that number down to 51. There are ways of looking at something which would give us a similar protection to the German model. There, obviously, you can't take the 50+1 German model off the shelf, but there are organisations like the Purpose Foundation who would provide, in essence, an underpinning that would mean that fan ownership is enshrined in such a way, it cannot be circumvented. So rather than continually having conversations every time we go, oh, we'd quite like to sell a bit more, but it will erode that threshold a bit more, and you know that we could in fact potentially take that whole thing off the table, enshrine fan ownership such that it can't ever be threatened again, but at the same time to speak to the understandable concerns of other people about, you know, how do we monetize the club and how do we take advantage of how it could grow. You could potentially do both of those at the same time by enabling something that would underpin that kind of Germanic model of going, this isn't even a question. You know, it doesn't even matter what the offer now is. We are not going to abandon that principle. That's how we work. However, from that other point, there are other ways of bringing other people in, you know, whether it's a new Nick Robertson or whoever else, or, you know, anyone that Freddie Flaxman talks to in America. There are ways of bringing people in who buy into the story, and that without that being in jeopardy. And that would be my personal preference at the moment. And as I said, I've spoken to Dave Boyle, for example. You know, if you were stuck from a standing start now, you wouldn't pick the slightly sclerotic, incredibly confused Don's Trust constitution that we currently have. Its rules around meetings are obviously stuck in a pre-digital era. It's actually quite bad at fan engagement. You know, the number of fan motions that get opposed by the board and then don't get through. So there are some small things to tidge around the edges. So I would like to put the whole thing together and say, right, here is a new structure that we believe will work better, and then put that to a vote. But obviously the very creating of that idea, as with the Back in 2 Ticks campaign, as with Bring the Dons Home, as with the bond, would be created through a kind of consensus before it was put back to members. That would be what I would advocate for.
Another question, talking about restricted actions. At the moment, the threshold is 75%. Do you think that's about the right sort of margin to get them to pass a restricted action, or do you think it needs to be a higher threshold or lower even?
I think the question's a bit of a red herring, to be honest, because apart from anything else, unless you hit 75%, you couldn't change it anyway. Yes, it seems fine. It seems fit for purpose to protect what's most important, but actually making minor changes around the edges isn't what's required here. What's required is to go, okay, how do we ensure we've got something where we don't all spend valuable time and resources debating something that there is pretty much broad agreement on? How can we have a better structure in which these things are enshrined, and then we can we can crack on and progress.
Okay, Greg Clark has this week resigned from various governing bodies, from the FA and FIFA, for the reasons I'm not going to go into. Do you think the Dons Trust and the board is doing enough to embrace diversity? And what more do you think the board could be doing?
Well, I think everyone I've ever seen on the Dons Trust board is capable of talking in public without being racist, misogynist and homophobic within 5 minutes. So we're a long way ahead of Greg Clark and the FA. I think the short answer is probably no. I know that there have been, Jane has been spearheading some great work on diversity and inclusion. Whilst being very pro diversity and inclusion, it's not an area I would claim to have done much work in myself. I think there's always more we could be doing. And as I think I said in something on the pro boards, it's something we should be doing for 2 reasons. One, because it's the right thing to do, but 2, because even as it were on a more cynical view of it, it's what the football club stands for. And we want to be as inclusive and diverse as possible to bring as many people on board as possible. And when you look particularly at the success of the community work, I mean, there's real testimony to that through what DLAG is doing. It would be nice to see that reflected in people coming to games. And obviously it would therefore be nice to see that reflected at board level. So yeah, I'd wholeheartedly support any initiatives to develop it further, but it would be disingenuous to claim I've got any personal great answers as to how we do
it. One final question: where do you see the club in 10 years' time?
That's a good question. I mean, we've always defied predictions at every other point, haven't we? I think it's entirely possible on the pitch that we are certainly looking upwards into the second tier, potentially even yo-yoing up to and into and out of the Championship. There's a fairly reasonable chance that that football has a bit of a resettlement out of this, and that clubs can't keep spending beyond their means, in which case we could be quite well positioned. But I think more importantly, we will have had a decade back at the heart of our community. You can't really overstate the difference to being where we are now back at Plough Lane to being stuck out halfway towards Kingston. I think we will have engaged so fully with our local community. That's what I would like to see us do most. I would like to see us develop that that commercial and that sponsorship side, but also all of those links with everyone locally. Because if we're doing all of the things locally that we've already started and we've grown, then we'll all be having a great time every weekend anyway, because we'll be plugged into being the heart of being what we can be. We'll win some games, we'll lose some games, but by that point I would like us to be still obviously very much still fan owned and very much a beacon for how football clubs can be run for the benefit of everyone who comes to get involved.
Charlie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.